When I first encountered the eternal question of God's existence, I approached it as I would any mathematical problem, with rigorous analysis, careful calculation, and systematic evaluation of evidence. What I discovered was startling. Atheism, when subjected to probability theory, becomes not just improbable but mathematically untenable. The same logical principles that govern geometric proofs and algebraic equations reveal that denying God's existence requires accepting infinite risk for finite gain. Today, I'll demonstrate how mathematical reasoning itself points inexorably toward faith, making atheism a gamble no rational person should take. Through probability calculations, risk analysis, and logical demonstration, we'll see why the mathematical mind naturally leads to belief, not skepticism. This isn't mere philosophical speculation but rigorous mathematical proof that atheism violates the fundamental principles of rational decision-making. Chapter 1: The Mathematics of Infinite Stakes and Expected Value. Let me begin with a fundamental principle from probability theory that I developed through my correspondence with Fermat. When calculating expected value, we multiply the probability of an outcome by its potential gain or loss. This simple formula becomes profound when applied to ultimate questions of existence and meaning. Consider the atheist's position carefully. They wager that God does not exist, hoping to gain freedom from moral constraints and religious obligations. But what are the mathematical stakes involved in this calculation? If the atheist is wrong about God's non-existence, the loss is infinite, eternal separation from the source of all good, truth, and beauty. If they're right, the gain is finite, perhaps a few decades of perceived autonomy from divine authority. The mathematical formula is straightforward: finite gain multiplied by any probability less than certainty, versus infinite loss multiplied by any probability greater than zero. Even if we assigned God's existence only a 1% probability, which itself would be mathematically unjustifiable given the evidence, the expected value calculation would overwhelmingly favor belief. When we multiply infinite loss by even the smallest positive probability, the result remains infinite negative expected value. Conversely, finite gain multiplied by high probability yields only finite positive expected value. This isn't mere philosophical speculation but mathematical certainty derived from probability theory. The arithmetic alone demonstrates that atheism requires accepting mathematically infinite negative expected value. No rational calculator, whether human or mechanical, would recommend such a wager. It violates the most basic principles of decision theory under uncertainty. The atheist typically responds by claiming this reduces belief to mere calculation, missing the point entirely. Mathematics doesn't create truth, it reveals truth. When mathematical analysis points overwhelmingly in one direction, rational minds follow the evidence rather than resist it through emotional preference. Chapter 2: The Probability Matrix of Converging Divine Evidence. As I developed probability theory through systematic analysis of games of chance, I realized these same principles apply with even greater force to evaluating evidence for God's existence. The mathematical concept of independent probabilities becomes crucial here. Consider the cumulative probability of multiple independent lines of evidence all pointing toward the same conclusion. The fine-tuning of physical constants represents one stream of evidence. The probability that fundamental forces would align precisely within the narrow parameters necessary for stable matter, stellar formation, and complex chemistry occurs by chance alone is mathematically negligible. Cosmologists calculate this probability at roughly 1 in 10 to the 60th power, a number so small it approaches mathematical impossibility. The emergence of consciousness from purely material processes presents another independent probability challenge for atheism. Despite decades of neuroscientific research, no mechanism has been identified by which electrical impulses in neural networks could generate subjective experience, self-awareness, or rational thought. The probability that mindless matter spontaneously generates mind appears vanishingly small. The universality of moral intuition across cultures provides a third independent line of evidence. If humans are merely evolved animals, the universal recognition of moral obligations becomes probabilistically inexplicable. Why would natural selection produce beings who consistently act against immediate self-interest for abstract moral principles? The mathematical likelihood approaches zero. Using the multiplication rule for independent events, when multiple improbable events must all occur for atheism to be true, their combined probability becomes exponentially smaller. Even assigning each line of evidence a generous 30% probability of having naturalistic explanation, the combined probability of all requiring purely material causes becomes 0.3 times 0.3 times 0.3 is equal to 0.027, or less than 3%. This is the mathematical principle of converging probabilities. When multiple independent streams of evidence point in the same direction, their combined weight exceeds the sum of their individual parts. The atheist must explain away not just one or two anomalies, but an entire constellation of evidence. Mathematically, this becomes exponentially more difficult with each additional line of evidence. Chapter 3: The Logical Impossibility of Infinite Regress in Causation. My extensive work with infinite series in mathematics taught me that not all infinities are logically viable or mathematically meaningful. The atheist faces a particular challenge with infinite regress, the claim that the universe requires no first cause because causal chains can extend infinitely backward in time. But rigorous mathematical analysis reveals this position as logically impossible. In my studies of the infinitesimal and infinite sequences, I learned that meaningful infinite series must converge to determinate values. An infinite regress of causes without a first cause is mathematically equivalent to trying to subtract infinity from infinity, an operation that yields no determinate result and violates basic mathematical principles. Consider the mathematical concept of limits. Every meaningful infinite sequence approaches a specific value as its limit. When we trace causation backward through time, if this sequence is to be mathematically meaningful rather than absurd, it must approach a limiting value, an uncaused first cause. Without this limit, we have mathematical indeterminacy masquerading as explanation. Furthermore, we observe in rigorous mathematics that infinite sequences without convergent points produce logical contradictions. Applied to causation, this means an infinite chain of causes without a primary source generates the same kind of logical impossibilities we find in mathematical paradoxes. The mathematical concept of sufficient reason also applies here. Each effect in a causal chain requires sufficient cause for its existence. But an infinite regress provides no sufficient reason for the entire chain's existence, it merely pushes the question back infinitely without ever providing an answer. This is like trying to support a building with an infinite series of foundations, each requiring support from the one below. Mathematically, this provides no actual support at all. In geometric proofs, we reject arguments that lead to infinite regress because they fail to establish their conclusions. The same mathematical rigor should apply to metaphysical arguments. An infinite regress of causes is like a geometric proof that never reaches its conclusion, it fails to prove what it claims to demonstrate. The alternative is mathematical absurdity, claiming that infinite regression somehow produces finite, determinate effects we observe in the universe. No mathematician would accept such reasoning in geometric proof, we shouldn't accept it in causal arguments either. Chapter 4: The Experimental Verification of Divine Action Through Systematic Testing. Through my experiments with atmospheric pressure, vacuum formation, and barometric measurement, I learned that legitimate hypotheses must be tested against observable reality through controlled conditions. Applying this same experimental rigor to spiritual questions yields remarkable and measurable results that consistently support theistic over atheistic hypotheses. Prayer. properly understood and practiced, becomes a controlled experiment, specific requests made under defined conditions, with measurable outcomes evaluated over time using the same statistical methods I applied to probability calculations. This isn't wishful thinking or subjective interpretation, but systematic data collection subject to mathematical analysis. My own spiritual experiment began with profound skepticism toward religious claims. I approached Christian assertions about divine response to prayer with the same methodological rigor I brought to physical experiments. The protocol involved specific, measurable requests for guidance, character transformation, and circumstantial changes, documented carefully over extended periods. The results proved statistically significant beyond reasonable doubt. Genuine prayer, approached with the same intellectual honesty I brought to barometric experiments, produces verifiable results in personality change, circumstantial alignment, and increased understanding that correlate directly with spiritual practice rather than chance occurrence. The atheist typically refuses to conduct this experiment, claiming it's unscientific. But this demonstrates profound inconsistency with experimental methodology. It's equivalent to a mathematician rejecting geometric proofs without working through the calculations, or a scientist dismissing physical theories without conducting the supporting experiments. The experimental method demands we test hypotheses fairly rather than dismiss them through a priori assumptions. When approached with genuine scientific openness, the same intellectual honesty that led to breakthroughs in mathematics and physics, spiritual reality proves as demonstrable as atmospheric pressure or geometric relationships. The control groups in this experiment are those who approach prayer with genuine openness versus those who approach it with predetermined skepticism or mere ritual repetition. The data consistently shows that honest spiritual seeking produces measurable results, while closed-minded approaches or superficial religious activity produces minimal change. This experimental evidence doesn't contradict scientific methodology. It extends scientific methodology into previously unexplored territory. The same principles that validate physical theories can validate spiritual hypotheses when applied with appropriate rigor and intellectual honesty. Chapter 5: The Mathematical Contradiction of Atheistic Ethics and Moral Reasoning. During my studies of social mathematics, decision theory, and the logical foundations of human reasoning, I discovered that moral obligations create insurmountable computational problems for atheistic worldviews. If humans are merely evolved animals responding to environmental pressures, moral imperatives become mathematically undefined, equivalent to dividing by zero in arithmetic operations. There exists no logical basis within materialistic frameworks for claiming that helping others is objectively superior to harming them, or that truth-telling is inherently better than deception. These preferences might serve evolutionary functions, but they carry no objective mathematical weight that would make them binding on rational agents. Yet every person, including the most convinced atheists, operates daily on the fundamental assumption that moral obligations are real, objective, and universally binding. They condemn injustice, praise sacrificial love, and make decisions based on ethical principles that transcend mere personal preference or cultural conditioning. This creates what I call a mathematical contradiction in atheistic thinking. They must simultaneously affirm that morality is illusory, being merely evolutionary conditioning without objective reality, while living as if moral obligations possess absolute validity and universal application. The mathematics of consistency theory, which I applied in my logical works, demonstrates this position as internally contradictory. Either moral obligations are objectively real and require a transcendent source that grounds their validity, or they're completely illusory and we should abandon them entirely as meaningless evolutionary artifacts. The middle position, that moral obligations are simultaneously real and illusory, binding and non-binding, objective and subjective, violates the most basic principles of logical mathematics. It's equivalent to claiming that a geometric theorem is both true and false simultaneously, or that a mathematical equation both equals and doesn't equal its solution. Atheists typically choose to live as if morality is completely real while theoretically denying its objective foundation. This is mathematically equivalent to using geometric principles while denying the existence of mathematical truth, or applying algebraic operations while claiming numbers don't exist. The logical solution requires either embracing nihilistic amorality, which no atheist actually chooses, or acknowledging that objective moral truth requires an objective moral source beyond material causation. Mathematics itself points toward the necessity of transcendent grounding for the moral obligations we all recognize as valid. Chapter 6: The Convergence of Mathematical Beauty and Divine Intelligence. My extensive work with conic sections, geometric proofs, and the mathematical relationships underlying physical reality revealed something profound at points beyond mere material causation. Mathematical truth possesses an inherent beauty and elegance that transcends mere evolutionary utility or survival advantage. The surprising elegance of mathematical relationships, the perfect symmetry of algebraic equations, the unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated geometric theorems, the harmonious proportions found throughout natural phenomena, suggests intentional design rather than accidental emergence. Consider the mathematical constants that appear throughout physical reality: pi, the golden ratio, Euler's number, the fine structure constant. These emerge naturally from mathematical relationships, yet they display an aesthetic beauty that serves no obvious survival function. Why would brains evolved merely for survival and reproduction develop the capacity for mathematical appreciation that provides no reproductive advantage? The convergence of truth and beauty in mathematics suggests a mind behind mathematical reality, a divine mathematician whose thoughts we partially discover through our calculations and proofs. This isn't anthropomorphic projection but logical inference based on the same reasoning we use to recognize human intelligence behind elegant human-made theorems. When we encounter a beautiful mathematical proof, we recognize the intelligence of its creator. The proof's elegance and explanatory power point beyond itself to the mind that conceived it. Similarly, when we discover mathematical beauty embedded in physical reality, from the spiral arrangements of galaxies to the geometric patterns of atomic structure, we should recognize the intelligence behind these elegant relationships. The atheist must explain why mindless, purposeless material processes would accidentally produce mathematical beauty that perfectly suits minds capable of appreciating it. Why does the universe appear mathematically beautiful to mathematical minds? Why do we experience profound aesthetic satisfaction when discovering elegant mathematical relationships? The alternative explanation, that mathematical beauty emerges from divine intelligence expressing itself through natural law, provides both sufficient cause and satisfying explanation for these phenomena. The divine mathematician creates reality according to beautiful mathematical principles, then creates minds capable of discovering and appreciating this beauty. This mathematical argument for divine intelligence gains strength from the observed universality of mathematical truth across cultures and the progressive nature of mathematical discovery. We don't invent mathematical relationships, we discover them as objective features of reality that existed before human investigation. Chapter 7: The Complete Cost-Benefit Analysis of Faith versus Atheistic Doubt. My final and most comprehensive mathematical argument against atheism emerges from decision theory and complete cost-benefit analysis applied to life's ultimate questions. Even maintaining agnosticism about God's existence, rational decision-making requires systematic evaluation of potential costs and benefits associated with different belief choices. The mathematical costs of Christian faith, when honestly assessed and calculated, prove remarkably minimal. Regular prayer and worship that provide psychological benefits even from purely naturalistic perspectives, moral behavior that generally improves life quality, relationships, and social functioning, and hope that provides measurable psychological resilience during suffering and uncertainty. Modern psychological research consistently demonstrates that religious practice correlates with improved mental health, stronger social connections, greater life satisfaction, and increased resilience during crisis. Even if religious beliefs were ultimately false, the practical benefits create positive expected value. The potential benefits of Christian faith are mathematically maximal, eternal happiness beyond current comprehension, present peace that transcends circumstantial changes, and ultimate meaning that transforms suffering into purposeful growth rather than meaningless pain. Conversely, the costs of committed atheism include existential despair about ultimate meaninglessness, moral uncertainty without objective grounding, psychological burden of believing life ends in permanent extinction, and the responsibility of creating meaning ex nihilo without transcendent foundation. The potential benefit of atheism is avoiding religious obligations and maintaining intellectual autonomy, finite gains that provide temporary satisfaction but offer no solution to fundamental human needs for meaning, purpose, and transcendence. But the potential cost of atheism, if theism proves true, is infinite loss, permanent separation from ultimate truth, beauty, and goodness. Even assigning low probability to theistic truth, when multiplied by infinite loss, produces infinite negative expected value. Any rational calculator would recommend the choice with positive expected value over the choice with negative expected value. This isn't mere pragmatism but mathematical logic applied to life's ultimate decision. The atheist essentially argues that mathematical reasoning shouldn't apply to the most important decision humans face. This is equivalent to claiming that careful calculation matters for financial investments but becomes irrelevant for eternal investments, a position that violates basic principles of rational decision-making. Furthermore, the atheist typically misses that Christian faith doesn't require abandoning intellectual honesty but rather applying intellectual honesty more completely and consistently than atheistic alternatives allow. Conclusion. Through systematic mathematical analysis, we've demonstrated that atheism fails every test of logical consistency, probabilistic reasoning, and rational decision-making. The cumulative evidence, properly calculated using the same mathematical principles that govern successful scientific inquiry, overwhelmingly favors theistic belief over atheistic alternatives. More importantly, we've discovered that rigorous mathematical thinking doesn't oppose religious faith but naturally supports and deepens it. The divine mathematician who authored the elegant equations we discover through scientific research invites us to know him personally through the same intellectual honesty that drives our best mathematical work. I challenge you to approach this ultimate question with complete mathematical rigor, apply probability theory systematically, consider all evidence carefully, conduct the experimental test of genuine prayer, and follow the logical implications wherever they lead. Mathematics itself will guide you toward the transformative truth that revolutionized my own life. Faith and reason are natural allies, not enemies, in the search for ultimate reality.